Stay tuned for an historically important game. Why? Because who is playing in the game? Alireza Firouzja and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Now, you probably know who Firouzja is. He's the youngest player in history to reach a rating of 2,800. He's only 18. But Abdusattorov, who's 17 years of age and almost 2,700, just won the World Rapid Chess Championship. He beat the likes of Nepomniachtchi. He beat Magnus Carlsen, and he beat Carlsen in Carlsen's own style. Oh, an endgame grind and a queen and pawn endgame. And this game between Firouzja and Abdusattorov, I think, very well may be the future of chess. Just like Kasparov and Karpov dominated for a 25-year period, I would not be shocked if Firouzja and Abdusattorov are the two titans of chess for many years to come. And I hope you enjoy this game. Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery. Firouzja has the white pieces. Abdusattorov has the black pieces. Now, let's put this out there. This game is very instructive. The things are very clear. It's not a masterpiece, but it's going to be historically important because of the players involved. Let's jump right in. Firouzja with white begins with d4. Abdusattorov plays knight to f6. Firouzja plays the Trompovsky opening, and Abdusattorov plays g6. He's saying, go ahead, take my knight. I don't care if you harm my pawn structure. Firouzja goes ahead and plays knight to d2. He doesn't grab the f6 knight, and let's look why. If bishop takes knight, ef6, and what black will do is they'll play c6, d5, and f5, put their pawns on light squares, get a bind on the e4 square, and play that f8 bishop to d6. They've got the two bishops. Now, white still may be slightly better, but black has easy play, and Firouzja doesn't want to give him easy play. So instead he plays knight to d2, threatening to play e4 and getting a full pawn center. d5 by Abdusattorov to control e4. e3, bishop to g7, c3. And what we have here is sort of a semi-Slav reverse, but white has gotten his his dark squared bishop outside of the pawn chain. So the bishop is at g5. You got pawns on c3, d4, and e3, creating a strong dark squared control in the center. Castles, knight g to f3, and we've basically transposed into a Torre attack, which is an opening where white would have played the knight to f3 and only then the bishop, but through a reversal of moves, we would have gotten that position. c6, bishop e2. Now, bishop g4. Basically, what we do is we get a battle of pawn breaks. What Abdusattorov wants to do in this position is play the pawn from e7 to e5. You can break with either the c-pawn or the e-pawn, but he's already committed the c-pawn to c6. So he wants to play that pawn to e5. With the bishop to g4, he wants to take that knight at f3 because the knight at f3 defends the e5 square, right? Now, it will be replaced by another knight, but that will leave Abdusattorov with three minor pieces that can support the e5 push. It's kind of complicated, but you'll see it as the game unfolds. Firouzja says, okay, I'm okay with that, because after h3, bishop f3, knight f3, now I've got the two bishop advantage. I've got a little something to work with myself. Knight b to d7, castles, and now knight to e4. What this does, it hits the bishop at g5, and if black were to take that, then the two bishop advantage would be gone. It also opens up the g7 bishop to the e5 square. So now he's got two pieces, the bishop and the knight, preparing to push e5. So Firouzja plays the bishop to f4, so the knight can't capture it, and also now he's got another piece controlling e5, preventing that pawn break. Abdusattorov plays queen to b6. Now this was the novelty of the game, the new move, the move that had never been played before, hitting that b2 pawn. Firouzja plays queen to c2. Now his pawn break is c4. So Firouzja wants to play c4, Abdusattorov wants to play e5, and what happens is they both succeed. Abdusattorov plays rook f to e8, further supporting that e5 push, and Firouzja goes ahead and plays c4 right then and there, and boom, black plays e5. So we have this incredible tension in the center with all of these pawns. But Alireza Firouzja sees this position and says, I can create an isolated pawn for black. And I think I'll do that. I think I'll create an isolated pawn, and that's what he does. He takes on e5 and exchanges twice. Takes, 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 takes. Now cd5. And Abdusattorov can't avoid the isolated pawn, because if he takes with the rook, then queen just takes knight. He just would lose a piece. So he's forced to take with the c-pawn. So black has an isolated pawn, but his pieces are fine. The knight is well placed on e4, but in a game with a fast time control like this one, having that isolated e-pawn, or excuse me, that isolated d-pawn, gives white an easy plan. He sort of knows where to put his pieces. He can make his moves quickly. And although computers see this as equal, it's just easier for black to go wrong. It's a good practical choice for Firouzja to play into this position. So rook a to d1. He begins to put pressure on the isolated pawn on d5. Rook to d8. When you have an isolated queen's pawn, your first strategy is almost always to advance the pawn. If you can, you want to advance that pawn and either liquidate it or gain more space. Firouzja knows that. So what he does is he plays rook to d4. He blockades that pawn. Now the pawn can't advance because the rook is sitting on the square that the pawn wants to advance to. Abdusattorov plays knight to d6. What he wants to do is play the knight to f5, hit that rook on d4, push it away, and then play d4. So we have this big battle over the d4 square that's going on right now. Rook f to d1, adding to the pressure, and now knight to f5. Strategically, this is the right idea. The problem is that the knight is tactically vulnerable. It's a bit fragile on the f5 square, as we will soon see. So Firouzja plays rook 4 to d3. Instead of playing knight to d6, and this is computer evaluation, and one of these lines is really spectacular, the better move is actually to play rook to c8, gaining a tempo against the queen. The knight at d6 defends the rook. That's why you can do that. Hitting the queen and pushing it to b1. And the reason is it removes that rook from a pin along the d file. This is really subtle stuff, computer stuff. Then knight to f5. And this would be a better execution of the plan. So here, if white just plays rook 4 to d3, now d4 can be played. And if white tries to kick the knight out with g4, get this. Black gives up the knight. Pawn takes, and after pawn takes knight, boom, pawn takes f2 with check. The queen at b6 defends that pawn at f2. King has to go to f1. Rook doubles, hitting the bishop at e2. White defends, and then rook takes f5, and black is better. He's got massive value for the sacrificed piece. He's got 3 pawns, which is equal material, and look at the safety of the king. The white king is in real peril, real trouble. This would have been a nice way to go. Firouzja wouldn't have played into this line if black had played c8, obviously, rook to c8. But that's what would have happened if the same thing that happened in the game happened here. So knight to f5, and here he plays this move, now d4. And the problem is that pawn is pinned against that rook on d8. So all he has to do is apply pressure, boom, to the knight at f5, and remove the defender of the d4 pawn. Computers actually prefer g4, but Firouzja definitely made the right choice, because why complicate matters? Why make your king less safe in a blitz game when you know you have control over the position? So bishop g4 really does make a lot more practical sense, I think, in the real world. And here, of course, black can't play the de3 move we just looked at, because boom, rook takes d8 check, and he would just lose the rook. So Abdusattorov plays rook to c5, gaining a tempo against the queen at c2, but the queen moves to d2. And now look at those heavy pieces of Firouzja's. Rook, queen, rook. Boom. Right up the file. Pin on the d4 pawn. The d4 pawn cannot be saved. So in this position, Abdusattorov says, I'm going to throw away the pawn. Maybe I can find some activity on the c file. The problem is he steps into this pin on this square. Computers prefer the move queen to f6 to defend the pawn that way. And after ed4, rook c to d5, going ahead and taking on f5, queen takes f5, and here white's up a pawn. But black has the pawn firmly blockaded, and it's actually hard for white to make progress here. White's the only one with winning chances, obviously, but this is still a lot of work left for white in this position. But after rook d to c8, stepping into that pin, boom, e4. He bypasses the d4 pawn with the e pawn, and it hits the pinned knight at f5, and it's coming towards the end. Knight d6, bishop c8. Abdusattorov plays knight to c4, an in-between move hitting the queen at d2. The queen moves to e2, rook takes c8. b3 hitting the knight first, knight a3, rook a4. Knight goes to b5, and then rook to c4, offering the trade of rooks. And being up an exchange, plus a pawn, totally safe king, no counterplay, Abdusattorov resigned in what I think is an early game between two future chess titans. I hope you enjoyed it. Join us again at Chess Dog. Goodbye.